You're going to find out that a very common question I ask is what case and number is a noun, and then what is its grammatical function. And there are only a set number of grammatical functions I expect you to know. There are other aspects of nouns that we will learn down the road, but as far as grammatical function goes, these are the basic jobs the nouns do in fairly simple sentences. And so I'm going to go through them with a decent amount of detail just so you can make sure you master these before we dive into greater complexity of Latin nouns. So the first grammatical function you always learn is the subject. And as you know, the subject of a verb always does the action of a verb. So in these sentences, the subject caecilius is the subject of est. Metella is the subject of emet. Milites is the subject of incesserunt. And ora is the subject of errant. So a couple things. Obviously, even though Latin word order is quite flexible, subjects almost always show up at the beginning of the sentence. And then secondly, remember that subjects and verbs must agree. So in these first two sentences, metella and caecilius are singular, and the verbs are singular. In these next two sentences, milites and ora are both nominative plural, and the verbs are plural. Ora is neuter, so that's that neuter nominative plural ending. So make sure you look at the verb when you're trying to identify the subject, because if you have a singular verb and you think that the subject is plural, you're going to have to figure out where you went wrong. Either you're misidentifying the verb or you are misidentifying the subject. Grammatical function number 2 is the predicate nominative, and as you can imagine, that's going to be in the nominative case. And the predicate nominative comes after the verb to be, or any linking verb, but it's the most commonly after the verb to be. In these first two sentences, it's pretty straightforward. We have caecilius is the father. Caecilius is the subject. Est operates as an equal sign. Father is the predicate nominative. In the second sentence, Grumio was very happy. Grumio is the subject. Erat acts as an equal sign. And then litissimus is a predicate nominative. You can also call it a predicate adjective, but if you just call it a predicate nominative, that'll cover both. These next two are a little tricky because if I were to ask you the grammatical function of milites, it's the first word in the sentence. It could be nominative plural. You think, okay, that might be the subject. But now look at this verb here, sumus. That mus ending tells you it's we. So this sentence would actually be translated, we are soldiers. So the subject is the implied we embedded in that verb, which means milites here is the predicate nominative. So watch out when I ask what the grammatical function of a noun is in a sentence, and the verb is to be, the verb is a form of to be, make sure you kind of translate the sentence in your head to see whether this noun comes in front of or after that form of to be. Same thing here, esne mercator, are you a merchant? Again, the subject is the you ending that's embedded in s, that verb, which puts mercator after s, which means it is a predicate nominative. So, both the subject and the predicate nominative must be nouns in the nominative case. So, often I start with what case is something and then move on to the grammatical function, but sometimes it's good to kind of look at the sentence and determine the grammatical function and then double check that it's actually in the nominative case. So, remember, if you tell me something is a subject or a predicate nominative, these are the only endings that those words can be. Obviously, this third declension asterisk gets a little tricky because third declension nominative singulars are anything under the sun. But, and I've added these neuter endings as well to remind you that neuter plural nominatives end in A. But if you find yourself thinking something is a subject or a predicate nominative and it has an ibus ending, for example, or an is ending, long is or something like that, pause and look back over the sentence and make sure that the ending corresponds to the case that corresponds to the subject and the predicate nominative. Another grammatical function is possession. And sometimes I'll say how do you translate it, and possession is translated with either the English word of or apostrophe s or s apostrophe. So, in this sentence, the dog of Caecilius is Cerberus. So this guy there is showing possession. Caecilius owns the dog. In this next sentence, Metella washes the togas of Quintus. Quintus owns the togas, so this is showing possession. This next sentence, I dined with friends of my father. That is is the possessive genitive singular. You can tell that that's a genitive, and this is either dative or ablative plural because there's a long mark there. So this patris is genitive showing possession. And then the slave guards the money of his mistress. So as you can see, usually if somebody or something is possessing another thing, that genitive very often comes right after the thing possessed. So that will help you a little bit. You can translate it either the money of the mistress or the mistress's money. And this is the only grammatical function of the genitive case. The genitive case will be used for other things, and we'll talk about that later. But if I ask you what is the grammatical function and its genitive, this is the only basic grammatical function of the genitive case. Now that we're out of the nominative and we don't have to worry about the either neuter rules or the weird third declension nominative singular, you can see that the genitive case endings, it only has these 10 endings. So, again, if you find yourself identifying something as genitive and it is not one of these endings, then you need to rethink your process. The other nice thing about the genitive plurals, on the one hand, they're kind of tricky because this makes you think of accusative, but they all have a in them, and 3 of them have an rum, so that'll help you kind of keep track of those genitive endings. The genitive singular endings often look a lot like the nominative plural, at least in those 3 declensions, and then, the AE looks like the dative. Third declension IS, the main thing you need to remember is that there is no macron on that third declension IS ending. If there's a macron, if it's a long IS, that's going to be either dative or ablative plural. So that's a really useful macron difference to keep track of. The indirect object is one of 2 grammatical functions for the dative case, and it's translated 2 or 4. And I find the dative one of the trickiest cases to identify, so sometimes you kind of have to translate your way into the dative case. In this sentence, Caecilius gave a gift to Quintus. That's the dative case. There will never be a preposition there. In this next sentence, I bought cookies for the students. That IS ending is, it's got a long mark, which means it has to be either dative or ablative. There's no preposition in front of it, which you will find eventually happens with both the dative and the ablative. But if you don't see a preposition, you really have to think to yourself, okay, could this be dative plural? And in this case it is. I bought cookies for the students. And then this last one, the soldiers showed their wounds to the centurion. That's centurioni there is a third declension dative ending showing the indirect object. So that's the first use of the dative case. The second grammatical function for the dative case is what I call verb takes dative. And there are a handful of verbs that take dative objects instead of accusative objects. I will never call them a direct object because officially that's not what they are, but when we translate them, they sound and they behave just like a direct object. So these are 5 of the most common verbs that take dative objects, but then there are also a collection of compound verbs, and the way you recognize those usually is it'll be a verb you recognize with a prefix on the front of it. So if you find yourself seeing kind of a verb base and then there's something tacked on the front, that could be a compound verb. Not all compound verbs take dative objects, but it's something to watch out for. So in this sentence, Caecilius trusts Quintus. It sounds like a direct object. It's the object of credit, but this is what's called a dative object. And so if I asked you what is the grammatical function of quinto, you would say verb takes dative, or VTD. The cookies please the slaves. Again, sounds like a direct object. You do not add to or for, but because placeo is one of these special verbs, servis here is dative plural, and that would be verb takes dative. We had approached the city. Again, dative object of appropinquo veramus. You know, your initial thought might be, oh, this is the first word in the sentence, let's start with city, but you look at this verb, it's we had approached, and then you remember it's a verb that takes the dative. And then these last two are compound verbs. The crowd is blocking or standing in the way of the Romans. So this is a verb takes dative because of the compound verb, and here you can see the verb sto stare means to stand, and then it's got this prefix on the front of it, ob, which means kind of face-to-face or in the way. And then the other one, cogidubnus, is in charge of the Britons. This is a compound verb. You've got the verb est, that's a very familiar word, and then you've got this prefix on front of it. That makes it a compound, and then that's why Britannis there is in the dative case. Remember that in the plural, all dative and ablative endings are exactly the same in each declension. So in the first and second declension, both the dative and ablative plural endings are that long is. Same thing, third and fourth, both the dative and the ablative are ibus, and in the fifth it's abus. So the big challenge is then differentiating between, is this ablative or dative? And you know, in previous years, because the ablative usually follows a preposition, you could use that as process of elimination. As we learn more and more ablative case uses that do not have prepositions, though, you will not be able to rely on that. So that's when you have to kind of really focus on the verb. Is it a verb of giving, showing, doing something for someone? So you can even try out. Put the words to or for in there and see if that translation makes sense. And then the other option is this word acting a lot like a direct object? Does it seem like it's the direct object, but it doesn't have an accusative ending? And if that's the case, check to see if it's a verb that either takes the dative or if the main verb is a compound verb. And if that's the case, chances are this is a dative word and it's either verb takes dative or a compound verb. So we've now moved on to the direct object. So the direct object is always going to be in the accusative case. We saw the eagle in the sky. Metella buys togas for Quintus. The soldiers wounded their chests and heads. Both of those are the direct object. And the boys praised the old men. As you can see, except for this first sentence, direct objects almost always show up in the middle of the sentence. A very common word order in Latin is subject, direct object, and then verb. And then as you can see, very often in the singular, accusatives end in am, and in the plural, they end in an s. So either m or s. That's going to be a common ending. So you won't add any sorts of extra prepositions. It's going to be the thing that the verb is happening to, and it's always going to be in the accusative case. The other use of the accusative case is object of some prepositions. And they are especially prepositions that show motion, although not all of them, and often it's motion towards. Again, not all of them, though. I like to think of accusative prepositions as taking up extent of something, whether it's distance or time. But I know that's a little abstract. But if you go through the garden, you can imagine, traveling through it. If you're going towards the house, you're traveling towards it. If you're standing near the ships, that doesn't work quite as well. At the house of cogidubnus, that apud, again, if you're dealing with one person, it's usually at the house of. If it's a crowd, it's amongst. And then amongst friends, here you can think of that accusative as being in between two kind of limits, in the middle of or amongst friends. So again, you'll always know that these are accusative endings, and I'm going to actually make this correction right now. This should be an M ending to make that accusative. So that's not confusing. At the house of cogito num, that should say. Here are the accusative endings. As I said, very often the singular ends in an M, but remember that also genitive plurals end in M, so don't stop there. You have to kind of use context. The plurals end in S. Remember that accusative plurals for all the declensions are the ablative singular plus S, so that's something to keep in mind. And then what's tricky here is you have to remember that the neuter plurals end in A, and then if there are any third declension neuters, it's going to look just like the nominative, so it will not always end in M. So those are the trickiest things about identifying accusatives, are remembering that neuter plurals can be A, and neuter singulars, especially in the third declension, won't look like an accusative because they're going to look just like the nominative, and the nominative follows no pattern. So now we've come to the last of the 5 major cases, and the only grammatical function for the ablative case, according to kind of my nomenclature, is object of the preposition. You will learn probably a dozen more uses of the ablative case, and it can get a little mind-boggling. But if I ask you what is the grammatical function of a word in the ablative case, the only possible answer is object of the preposition. And again, whereas I often say that accusative prepositions denote extent of something, ablatives often are just more kind of stationary and take up less space. They also often show awayness or separation. So that's why X, out of the shadows, without money, that you're separated from the money. You're in the forum, that is showing no motion, you're just stationary. You're with grumio, you're just right there in one place. And then de senibus, de is a preposition that can mean a million things, but almost always, at least when I read it, it means about. If it's a physical place, it might mean down from, but very often it will mean about. So let's look at these ablative case endings. As you can see, the singulars are all individual vowels. 3 of them have long marks. This one actually does have a long mark as well, but again, it doesn't make a huge difference because it doesn't help you differentiate. And then you've got the 2 long IS's. Keep in mind those can also be dative plurals. And then you've got the BUS's, either with I or E in front of them. So again, if you see these endings and they come after a preposition, it must be object of the preposition. As we start learning more uses of the ablative case, especially both with and without prepositions, it'll get a little trickier to tell the difference between ablatives and datives, but for now, if I ask the grammatical function, it must be object of a preposition.